The world had laughed at the wooden plane. Soon, it would stop laughing altogether. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this story, you'll understand how a wooden aircraft, dismissed as a joke, became one of the fastest, most feared machines of World War II. It was 1938, and across a polished table at the British Air Ministry, a man named Sir Geoffrey de Havilland unfolded a set of drawings that looked like something out of a carpenter's workshop. Not a war room. No guns. No armor. No turrets. Just a sleek, narrow shape made almost entirely of wood. The officials leaned in, blinking at the proposal as if it were a joke. One finally asked, half smiling, "You expect this toy to survive the Luftwaffe?" De Havilland didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, almost too polite. "If it's fast enough, it won't need to." The room erupted in murmurs. To men who had grown up on biplanes wrapped in canvas and steel, the idea bordered on lunacy. Britain was already at the edge of war. The skies over Europe were filling with Messerschmitts and Heinkels. And here was a man suggesting that the Royal Air Force put its faith not in armor, but in speed. And not in metal, but in birch and glue. The Air Ministry's requirements for new bombers at the time were blunt: more guns, more armor, more crew. Every new design was expected to be heavier and tougher than the last. De Havilland's drawings violated every expectation. His prototype would carry no defensive armament, rely solely on aerodynamics, and be constructed largely from plywood, a material the military associated with furniture, not flight. To them, it was an absurdity. But to de Havilland, it was logic. Metal was scarce. Factories were overloaded building Hurricanes and Spitfires. Yet wood, birch, spruce, balsa, was everywhere, handled daily by carpenters, cabinet makers, and piano builders. He saw not weakness, but freedom. He called his concept the DH-98, and on paper it was a ghost, fast, light, almost invisible to radar, its surface smooth and unbroken by rivets. While other designers begged for more armor, de Havilland wanted less drag. His philosophy boiled down to 3 words that would later define the aircraft: speed is armor. But in 1938, Britain wasn't ready for philosophy. The generals wanted guns. The engineers wanted aluminum. The bureaucrats wanted conformity. De Havilland left that meeting without approval, his designs dismissed as eccentric. Still, not everyone laughed. One man in that room, Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman, looked longer than the others. He had seen enough aircraft proposals to know when someone was onto something revolutionary. Freeman quietly told de Havilland, "Keep working. Don't let them bury it." De Havilland nodded. He'd spent decades designing aircraft: elegant biplanes, reliable trainers, graceful passenger planes. But this was different. He believed Britain would soon need something leaner, faster, smarter. Something born from craftsmanship, not factories. When war finally broke out in September 1939, the laughter stopped. But so did reason. The first year of fighting stripped away Britain's illusions of safety. The Luftwaffe had more planes, more pilots, more reach. German bombers hit London, Coventry, and Liverpool. The Air Ministry scrambled for solutions. The same officers who had mocked de Havilland now watched their aluminum squadrons burn. He returned with his blueprints. Nothing had changed, except the stakes. "If we cannot outgun them," he said, "then we must outrun them." Even then, approval came grudgingly. Officials labeled his project experimental, allocating limited resources and minimal funding. But Freeman signed off on a prototype order, a quiet act of defiance that would change aviation. In workshops at Hatfield, engineers began crafting the impossible. They bent sheets of birch around wooden molds, glued them together in layered sandwiches of balsa and plywood, and polished the surfaces until they gleamed. Where rivets once scarred aluminum skins, there were now seamless curves. It looked less like a machine of war and more like something sculpted. Outside, Britain braced for invasion. Inside, a small team worked through air raid sirens, convinced that one wooden plane could change everything. When a visiting officer stopped by to inspect progress, he chuckled at the sight. "You're building a furniture showroom," he said. De Havilland smiled faintly. "Then let's hope it's the fastest one in Europe." He wasn't exaggerating. In tests, calculations suggested the wooden frame could slice through the air with less drag than any metal aircraft of its size. Combined with 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, it promised a top speed exceeding 400 miles per hour, faster than the Spitfire, faster than anything the Luftwaffe fielded. But in 1940, those were just numbers. The skeptics wanted proof. And so, as the bombs fell over London in a hidden hangar at Hatfield, carpenters and engineers kept gluing, sanding, and shaping their dream. Every rib of wood was a gamble. Every seam of resin, a rebellion against convention. They didn't know it yet, but that gamble would soon become one of the most feared aircraft of the war. The world had laughed at the wooden plane. Soon, it would stop laughing altogether. By the summer of 1940, Britain was running out of almost everything, except resolve. The Battle of Britain had left factories smoking, docks in ruins, and aircraft production at breaking point. Every new bomber needed aluminum, and every ounce of aluminum was already being poured into Spitfires, Hurricanes, and repairs from nightly raids. The Air Ministry faced a simple, brutal equation. Without planes, Britain would die. Sir Geoffrey de Havilland saw that shortage not as an obstacle, but as opportunity. While officials debated how to squeeze more metal out of fewer resources, he argued for the unthinkable. Build aircraft from what the enemy couldn't bomb into shortage: wood. The skeptics still grumbled. The RAF's procurement board issued a formal response calling the proposal impractical under conditions of total war. But the reality outside those offices told a different story. Aluminum refineries in Scotland and Wales were overstretched. Imports from Canada were under threat from U-boats. The very material that made modern aircraft possible was disappearing faster than it could be replaced. And so, reluctantly, the government allowed de Havilland to continue, under minimal support, in secrecy. The project was officially classified as non-priority experimental, but inside de Havilland's Hatfield factory, it was treated like the war's most urgent secret. He repeated his mantra to the engineers: "Speed is armor." The idea was simple, but revolutionary. Armor weighed an aircraft down. Gun turrets created drag. Every added pound slowed escape speed and increased losses. But if a bomber could fly so fast that nothing could catch it, it wouldn't need armor or guns. It would survive by design, not defense. That concept flipped every RAF doctrine on its head. Meanwhile, the country was suffocating under the Blitz. Coventry burned, London smoldered, and fighter squadrons scrambled daily just to keep the Luftwaffe from dominating the skies. Factories had to adapt or vanish. Women poured into assembly lines. Skilled craftsmen from shuttered carpentry shops answered the call to join what they jokingly called the Wooden Air Force. De Havilland saw it differently. "Every hand that can carve, glue, or sand," he said, "can build a weapon faster than a forge." Birch plywood became his steel. Thin layers were laminated together with a lightweight balsa core, creating a structure that was strong yet flexible. Instead of rivets, they used casein and formaldehyde adhesives, cured in massive heated molds. The fuselage would be built in halves, each side shaped like a canoe, then joined together with precision that rivaled watchmaking. This method meant that the aircraft could be built almost anywhere. Instead of relying on massive industrial plants, de Havilland could contract furniture factories, piano workshops, and cabinet makers across Britain. It decentralized production. If one site was bombed, others could continue. The Air Ministry didn't understand it at first. They wanted statistics, not vision. But Freeman, the quiet ally who had backed de Havilland from the start, continued to defend the project. In late 1940, he authorized limited production materials and engine allocations. Without that one signature, the Mosquito might have died on paper. When Freeman visited Hatfield, he watched as engineers sanded the first fuselage mold to a mirror finish. The smell of sawdust filled the hangar. Instead of riveters, there were women in aprons applying resin with brushes, their hands steady despite the air raid sirens echoing outside. Freeman turned to de Havilland. "It's madness," he said softly, "but it might be the kind of madness we need." Outside, the Luftwaffe pounded Britain nightly. Pilots flew by firelight. Families hid in cellars. But inside that wooden shell, a revolution was taking shape. An aircraft that would prove that craftsmanship could beat mass production. De Havilland's engineers worked under blackout curtains, testing small aerodynamic models in makeshift tunnels. Each test confirmed what the designer already knew. Smooth wooden skin produced less drag than riveted aluminum. The monocoque structure, where the outer shell bore the stress instead of an internal frame, gave it strength and flexibility without weight. Every problem they solved brought the impossible closer. By October 1940, the prototype skeleton stood upright for the first time. Technicians walked around it in silence, almost reverently. It gleamed under the hangar lamps, a ghost of a plane, light enough to move by hand. To outsiders, it still looked like folly. To those who had built it looked like hope carved from timber. Britain's war effort was bleeding, its cities burned, but in that wooden frame lay a promise that speed and ingenuity could turn scarcity into strength. And so, as winter approached and the first frost crept across the hangars of Hatfield, de Havilland's team prepared for the moment no one had believed would come. The day their plywood toy would finally leave the ground. The first Mosquito wasn't built in a factory. It was crafted. By late 1940, while the Blitz hammered London night after night, quiet revolutions were happening behind blackout curtains across Britain. Not in steel mills, but in furniture factories and piano workshops, places where the smell of varnish and sawdust mixed with the fear of air raid sirens. These weren't typical war industries, but Geoffrey de Havilland had no choice. The Air Ministry wasn't giving him the metal, so he turned to wood, and the people who knew how to work it. Everywhere he looked, there were skilled hands suddenly without purpose. Cabinet makers from Liverpool, carpenters from Nottingham, joiners from Belfast. Men and women who had built furniture for country houses were now gluing together the body of a bomber. The government called them the shadow workforce. To the engineers at Hatfield, they were heroes. The process looked nothing like aircraft production. Instead of loud hangars filled with sparks and rivets, these workshops hummed with quiet focus. Sheets of birch plywood were laminated together with balsa wood cores, pressed under heat to form the Mosquito's smooth curves. Women worked long hours spreading formaldehyde resin glue with brushes, making sure there were no bubbles or gaps. When the glue dried, The joints were stronger than aluminum welds. The fuselage was built in two halves, each one shaped in a massive wooden mold like a boat hull. They were then joined together, sanded, and sealed under layers of varnish. The wings were one continuous piece of wood, built without metal spars. Everything about the process was elegant, efficient, and wildly unconventional. Each plane took around 30,000 man-hours to build, most of them by hand. But because wood was easy to work with, small factories across Britain could join the effort. In places like High Wycombe, Belfast, and Leavesden, carpenters swapped out furniture blueprints for aircraft schematics. In Toronto, Canada, the de Havilland subsidiary began production as well, turning the Mosquito into a truly international creation. Workers joked that they were building flying dining tables, but there was pride in the laughter. Many of the women assembling fuselages had never seen an airplane up close. They didn't realize they were helping construct one of the most advanced machines of the war. Still, conditions were brutal. Air raids forced frequent evacuations. Factories blacked out windows to hide the glow of glue heaters. Supplies were scarce. Balsa wood came from Ecuador, and shipments were often delayed by U-boats. Birch had to be rationed. Crews learned to patch together different grades of wood just to keep the line moving. Yet somehow, the work never stopped. Even during the worst bombings of 1941, production teams at Hatfield kept assembling the prototype in secret. Geoffrey de Havilland himself walked the factory floor daily. He wasn't just an engineer, he was a craftsman. He checked the curvature of every fuselage section, running his hand along the wood grain to feel for imperfections. He knew that one misaligned rib could destroy the dream. The workers called him the gentleman engineer. He treated every carpenter as if they were a partner in invention. "You're not just making a plane," he told them. "You're making history out of wood." By November 1940, the first prototype, W4050, was ready for testing. It was painted in a simple yellow primer. No guns, no markings, no camouflage. Just a wooden shell powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same ones used in the Spitfire. Engineers wheeled it out onto the runway at Hatfield under a gray sky. The Air Ministry sent observers, expecting a short test and a quiet failure. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the founder's son, climbed into the cockpit. He was calm, methodical, one of Britain's best test pilots. Mechanics checked the engines twice, fuel lines once more. Then the wooden propellers began to spin, and for the first time, the Mosquito rolled forward under its own power. The sound wasn't metallic. It was smooth, low, almost whisper-like. The plane accelerated across the runway, lighter than anyone had imagined. At 3:45 p.m. on November 25, 1940, W4050 lifted off. In that moment, every man and woman who had glued a seam or sanded a panel watched the impossible rise into the air. The Mosquito climbed effortlessly, its engines singing above the factory rooftops. Observers on the ground craned their necks in disbelief. It didn't just fly, it streaked. At full throttle, the prototype hit 382 miles per hour, faster than the Spitfire MKI. No bomber had ever moved like that. The plywood toy had just outperformed Britain's best fighter. When de Havilland Jr. landed, silence hung in the air. Then, quietly, someone from the Air Ministry whispered, "It's too fast to need guns." In the control tower, Geoffrey Sr. simply smiled. "That was the point," he said. It wasn't just a flight. It was a statement. A nation that was being bombed nightly had just seen proof that creativity could outrun destruction. For the carpenters and glue mixers who built it, That yellow wooden aircraft was no longer a prototype. It was proof that belief, precision, and wood could fly faster than fear. The world didn't know it yet, but the Mosquito had just changed the future of aerial warfare forever. When the Mosquito landed that afternoon, it wasn't supposed to change history. It was only meant to prove that a wooden aircraft could leave the ground. But what it did instead was humiliate every critic in the Air Ministry. In the official report, test engineers recorded the top speed as 382 miles per hour, an astonishing figure for an unarmed twin-engine plane made of plywood. It was faster than the Hurricane, faster than the Spitfire Mark I, and nearly untouchable by anything the Luftwaffe had in the sky. That night, as the de Havilland team gathered in the dimly lit test hangar, the disbelief still lingered. For months they had been mocked, denied materials, and told that speed without guns is suicide. Now the numbers said otherwise. The Mosquito had rewritten the physics of survival. Sir Geoffrey de Havilland stood quietly beside the prototype, running his hand along the varnished wood. The faint scent of glue still hung in the air. Around him, engineers murmured about the data, how the smooth monocoque structure reduced drag, how the dual Rolls-Royce Merlin 21 engines delivered fighter-level acceleration, and how the aircraft's clean lines produced aerodynamic efficiency unheard of in a bomber. De Havilland finally spoke. "You see, it doesn't need armor when nothing can catch it." Word spread fast. Within a week, the Air Ministry demanded more flight trials. The same officers who had once laughed at the plywood toy were now fighting to claim they'd supported it all along. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at Hatfield. By early 1941, W4050 was undergoing performance testing against Britain's top fighters. The results stunned even its creators. The Mosquito could climb to 30,000 feet faster than the Spitfire Mesca II and could outpace the Bf-10-9E at medium altitude. It wasn't just fast for a bomber, it was redefining what speed in aviation meant. De Havilland's gamble had worked because he understood something the bureaucrats didn't. Drag kills more planes than bullets. The Mosquito's wooden skin wasn't just a clever substitute, it was a secret weapon. Aluminum rivets created turbulence, but the Mosquito's seamless wooden surface sliced through air like a blade. It had no gun turrets, no armor plating, no defensive gunners weighing it down. Every ounce of saved weight went to fuel, altitude, and speed. The press soon got wind of it. British papers began calling it the Wooden Wonder, a name that stuck for the rest of the war. But there was another, more serious nickname whispered by Luftwaffe pilots months later, Der schnellste der Welt, the fastest in the world. Inside the RAF, however, not everyone was convinced. Many still doubted that an unarmed bomber could survive over occupied Europe. The traditionalists argued that no plane should fly without a gunner or armor. The very idea of sending crews unprotected into combat seemed reckless. It took one man to silence them, Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman. Freeman had been the Mosquito's quiet champion since the beginning, risking his career to fund it. When senior officers demanded more heavy bombers, he pushed back, saying, "The Mosquito can carry the same load, faster, and return to fight another day." He authorized small-scale production even before the RAF's formal acceptance, a gamble that saved months of precious time. While debates raged in London, Hatfield's production lines came alive. The first 10 Mosquitoes were already under construction, built by workers who barely had time to rest between raids. The glow of resin heaters and the hum of saws replaced the sound of rivet guns. Each aircraft carried a piece of the British home front. Its plywood came from Norfolk, its balsa from South America, its glue from Yorkshire. Every time one lifted off, It was a national effort taking flight. Then, in February 1941, the Mosquito made a public appearance that no one could ignore. It flew a demonstration against a formation of Spitfires for senior RAF commanders. Onlookers watched as the wooden plane streaked past, vanishing into the clouds before the Spitfires could even close distance. One officer turned to Freeman and said, "You've built the only bomber that can escort itself." That remark made it into the press the following week, and by then, the Mosquito was officially greenlit for full production. The laughter was over. Factories across Britain began receiving blueprints, molds, and work orders. Cabinet makers became aircraft builders overnight. Young women who once made wardrobes now shaped wings. The Mosquito was no longer a secret. It was a movement. And while most of Britain saw only the headlines, the Luftwaffe was already beginning to notice something strange. Their radar operators were reporting unknown contacts moving faster than anything on record. Interceptors were scrambled, but they never made contact. The first Mosquitoes had crossed the channel, and the war's most unlikely weapon was about to show the world that silence and speed could hit harder than steel and fire ever could. By the spring of 1941, what began as a ridiculed experiment was now an unstoppable production wave sweeping across Britain and Canada. But what truly made the Mosquito extraordinary wasn't just its speed, it was how it was built. Unlike any aircraft before it, the Mosquito didn't rely on sprawling industrial plants or heavy machinery. It was born in workshops, schools, and furniture factories, places never meant for war. The air smelled of lacquer, sawdust, and sweat instead of oil and gunpowder. And that was exactly why it worked. Britain's metal supply was stretched to the limit. Aluminum went first to Spitfires, Hurricanes, and bombers like the Lancaster. The Air Ministry had no resources left for another aircraft. De Havilland didn't argue. He simply sidestepped the problem. He turned to the one material Britain still had in abundance: wood. The Mosquito's body was built from birch plywood, sandwiched with balsa wood in between, two light, flexible materials that combined to form a structure both rigid and resilient. The design was called a monocoque shell. Instead of metal frames bolted together, the Mosquito's strength came from its smooth, seamless body. There were no rivets to catch air, no metal plates to weigh it down. The entire fuselage was one continuous aerodynamic surface. That design made it not only fast, but also stealthy. Radar of the time struggled to pick up wooden planes. They appeared faint or vanished entirely from German screens. It was an accidental advantage that made the Mosquito nearly invisible to early detection systems. In towns like High Wycombe, Hatfield, and Leavesden, ordinary people became part of something extraordinary. Joiners, woodcarvers, and women working 12-hour shifts built fuselage halves in molds the size of boats. They brushed glue by hand, pressed layers of birch and balsa, and clamped them overnight in heated presses. When the halves were joined, the seam was sanded so perfectly smooth that it looked like one solid piece. Every frame had to be flawless. Even a single uneven joint could cause deadly vibration at 400 miles per hour. Supervisors checked each section with micrometers, calling in engineers to inspect if a wing spar was off by even a millimeter. One worker at the Leavesden plant later recalled, "We used to say we weren't building planes, we were carving them." Even as air raids hit nearby towns, production never stopped. When sirens wailed, workers covered unfinished fuselages with tarps and huddled under benches, waiting for the all-clear. Then they went straight back to gluing. By late 1941, the first full-production Mosquitoes were rolling out, and the numbers were stunning. Each one took about 30,000 man-hours, half the workforce made up of women. Many of them were new to engineering, trained on the spot to assemble aircraft parts with the same care they once used for furniture. Canada joined the effort too. The de Havilland Aircraft of Canada factory near Toronto became a major production hub, building over 1,000 Mosquitoes using local timber. Crates of components crossed the Atlantic, wings, fuselage halves, even cockpit fittings, ready to be assembled in Britain. It was a global supply chain made entirely of wood. The logistics were staggering. More than 280 different subcontractors were involved in mosquito production at the peak of the war. Piano companies, violin makers, furniture shops, and even toy factories contributed parts. If a cabinet maker could craft a curve, they could craft a wing. And they did, under blackout conditions, with bombs falling nearby. Each mosquito that left the factory floor carried a hidden story, the fingerprints of craftsmen who'd never flown, the quiet determination of women who knew their work might decide whether pilots lived or died, and the pride of a nation building something beautiful out of necessity. When RAF squadrons finally received their first batches, pilots were skeptical. They tapped the wooden fuselage and joked, "Does it come with termites?" But after a few test flights, no one was laughing. It could reach 415 miles per hour, a speed unheard of for a bomber. It could climb to 35,000 feet, outrun interceptors, and fly farther than anything its size. De Havilland had proven his point beyond doubt. Speed itself was armor. The Mosquito wasn't protected by steel. It was protected by physics. That philosophy changed everything about how the RAF planned its missions. For the first time, they had an aircraft that didn't need escorts, didn't need turrets, and didn't need luck. It just needed space to run. And when the first crews took it into combat, the Luftwaffe discovered something new and terrifying. There was now a bomber that didn't fight back, because it never had to. The wooden wonder had taken flight, and no one could catch it. The first real test of the Mosquito didn't happen in a laboratory or a boardroom. It happened over enemy territory. By late 1941, Britain's bombers were struggling. The Luftwaffe's radar-guided flak and night fighters were tearing through slow-moving formations. Loss rates climbed into the double digits. Every raid meant another wave of telegrams to grieving families. And yet, in this darkness, a handful of RAF crews were preparing to fly something completely different. A bomber with no armor, no guns, and no escort. Their orders were simple: trust your speed. The Mosquito's first operational mission came on September 20th, 1941, when two unarmed prototypes flew a high-speed reconnaissance sortie over France. They returned without a scratch. The photos they brought back were so detailed that analysts could read the numbers on railway cars near Paris. The RAF's experiment was working. Within months, Mosquitoes were flying deep into occupied Europe, France, the Netherlands, even as far as Berlin, alone and unescorted. They flew so high and so fast that Luftwaffe interceptors couldn't reach them in time. When German radar operators tried to vector fighters onto them, the contacts vanished before the planes could scramble. At that point, the Mosquito became something entirely new: a weapon of information. The RAF's Photo Reconnaissance Unit, PRU, began using modified Mosquitoes stripped of paint and guns to save weight. Their mission? Fly over enemy territory, gather photographs, and return before the Germans even knew they'd been there. The statistics were staggering. The Mosquito could cross the English Channel, photograph a city like Hamburg or Cologne, and return in under 3 hours. No fighter in the Luftwaffe's inventory could intercept it at cruising altitude. One pilot, squadron leader Adrian Warburton, summed it up best. We didn't need to fight. We just didn't get caught. Then came the bomber variants, the B Mark IVs, which took the same unarmed philosophy and added precision to the mix. Instead of flying massive raids with hundreds of bombers, the RAF could now send a handful of Mosquitoes to strike critical targets at pinpoint accuracy. Their first headline mission came on September 25, 1942, when 4 Mosquitoes attacked the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, Norway. Flying at treetop level across the North Sea, they smashed into the building so suddenly that German defenses never had time to react. Every plane returned safely. Hitler was reportedly furious. For the first time, the Reich's own officers weren't safe even in their offices. The Mosquito's success forced a complete rethink of air strategy. The RAF had a bomber that could hit smaller, high-value targets, bridges, prisons, headquarters, without needing the massive formations that invited disaster. This was surgical warfare decades ahead of its time. But its adaptability didn't stop there. The Mosquito evolved faster than any aircraft before it. Engineers modified the same wooden airframe into versions that could handle almost any mission imaginable. Primaca 9 for photo reconnaissance, capable of reaching 38,000 feet. NF Mark 13 for night fighting, equipped with the revolutionary AI Mark 8 radar. FBMK-6 as a fighter bomber, carrying rockets, bombs, and cannons. FBMK-18 Tsetsis, armed with a 57mm Molin's gun that could sink ships. Every version kept the same spirit: light, fast, and precise. Don Bennett, commander of the Pathfinder Force, quickly realized its potential for night bombing. He called it the scalpel of the RAF. Instead of blanketing cities with bombs, his Mosquitoes flew ahead of heavy formations to mark exact targets with flares. The big bombers simply followed the light. Bennett's tactics turned chaos into coordination. Entire raids that once scattered across miles now hit within a few hundred yards of their intended aim points. Without the Mosquito, the RAF's precision bombing campaign would have been impossible. By early 1943, the Luftwaffe's top brass had a name for their new tormentor: the Wooden Ghost. Its radar signature was so faint that night fighter controllers often doubted their instruments. Pilots scrambled, chased shadows, and returned with empty fuel tanks. In frustration, General Joseph Kammhuber, head of Germany's night fighter command, declared, "We cannot catch them. They come when they please, and leave before we know it." Even Adolf Galland, Germany's most respected ace, later admitted, "The British wooden plane made our air defense look foolish." That was the power of simplicity. While the Germans poured resources into heavy, complex interceptors, the British quietly built thousands of lightweight aircraft that didn't play by the same rules. The Mosquito was never meant to dominate by force. It dominated by refusing to be caught. By 1943, it wasn't just another aircraft. It was a doctrine. And soon, the world would see what happened when the Wooden Wonder didn't just fly fast, but flew fearlessly. By 1943, the Mosquito had become a quiet legend, spoken of in briefing rooms and whispered about in Luftwaffe command posts. But its next chapter would turn that quiet legend into a roar. The RAF needed precision, the kind of accuracy no four-engine bomber could achieve, and the Mosquito, fast, low, and agile, became the chosen blade. It was Don Bennett, head of the Pathfinder Force, who turned that vision into strategy. He believed that if you could see the target, you could destroy it, and the Mosquito could always see. Flying ahead of the bomber streams, Pathfinder crews dropped flares over enemy positions, guiding the heavyweights behind them through clouds and darkness. Each mission saved hundreds of lives and thousands of wasted bombs. Bennett called his pilots the eyes of the RAF. The Germans called them ghosts. Then came the missions that defied logic. Mosquitoes striking targets hundreds of miles deep inside enemy territory, Berlin, Copenhagen, and even Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, all without escort. They flew low enough for pilots to see their reflections in rivers, then climbed at impossible angles to drop their payloads before vanishing into the clouds. One pilot compared the feeling to racing through hell with wings. By 1944, the Mosquito had earned a reputation not only for precision, but for style. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about defiance. The aircraft carried no turrets, no gunners, and often flew in daylight straight into the heart of occupied Europe. And then came one of the most daring raids in aviation history. Operation Jericho. On the morning of February 18, 1944, Group Captain Percy Pickard and Flight Lieutenant J.A. Broadley led 18 Mosquitoes of No. 140 Wing on a low-level strike against Amiens prison in northern France. Their mission wasn't to destroy, it was to liberate. Inside the prison were hundreds of French resistance members awaiting execution. Allied intelligence warned they would be shot within days. There was no time for a ground rescue. So the RAF decided to blow open the walls instead. The Mosquitoes flew at treetop height, their wingtips brushing the hedgerows of Picardy. Ground fire erupted, tracer rounds stitching the air. The first wave dropped bombs so precisely that they blew holes clean through the outer walls without collapsing the prison. The second wave came minutes later, shattering the guard towers. Dozens of prisoners escaped into the snow, sprinting toward the fields. The price was high. Pickard's Mosquito was hit by flak and crashed moments later, killing him and his navigator. But the mission succeeded. Allied command later called it one of the most daring and humane operations of the war. To this day, French historians still credit the Amiens raid as a symbol of courage and sacrifice, the moment when speed and precision combined with purpose. Operation Jericho cemented the Mosquito's legend. It proved that a bomber didn't need brute force to change history. It needed precision, timing, and the nerve to fly where no one else dared. And that wasn't the end. Just a few weeks later, the Mosquito struck again, this time at the Shellhus in Copenhagen, the Gestapo's Danish headquarters. The mission, on March 21, 1945, required pilots to navigate narrow city streets at rooftop level to avoid radar. They flew so low that one Mosquito clipped a lamppost. The raid was devastatingly effective. The building collapsed, destroying Gestapo records and freeing hundreds of prisoners from interrogation. But tragedy shadowed success. Several bombs struck a nearby school, killing civilians and children. It was a grim reminder of the cost of precision in an imperfect war. Even so, the Luftwaffe could not deny what it had seen. Germany's proud air defense network, the radar grids, the night fighters, the flak towers, was being humiliated by a wooden plane. General Joseph Kammhuber, architect of Germany's night defense system, tried everything: radar traps, new intercept tactics, and even specially equipped Mi-10-9s. None worked. The Mosquito could outclimb, outturn, and simply outrun them all. By late 1944, reports circulated that Germany had dedicated entire squadrons solely to intercepting Mosquitoes, and failed. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's ace and inspector of fighters, later wrote in his memoirs, "It made fools of us all." It was fast, agile, and everywhere. The RAF had created a paradox. A plane built by carpenters was now humiliating the Reich's most advanced engineers. But perhaps the greatest irony was that even as Germany entered the jet age with the Me-262, the Mosquito remained relevant. It couldn't outrun a jet, but it could outthink one. In the last months of the war, Mosquito pilots developed tactics to ambush Me-262s during takeoff and landing. The jets needed long runways and sluggish acceleration, an opportunity the RAF exploited ruthlessly. Squadrons like the 418th and 605th began waiting near jet bases, diving on the enemy when the engines were weakest. "Catch them before they catch the sky," one pilot said. Even in the dawn of jet warfare, the wooden plane stayed lethal. While others saw obsolescence, the Mosquito kept proving that innovation isn't about the material, it's about the mind behind it. It was proof that technology alone doesn't win wars. Imagination does. The Mosquito was never meant to dominate by fear. It dominated by being everything the enemy didn't expect: quiet, fast, invisible, and unstoppable. It had started as a punchline in the corridors of the Air Ministry. By 1944, it was the most respected aircraft in Europe, and soon it would evolve into something even more extraordinary: a hunter that carried a gun bigger than any fighter before it. The Tsetse Mosquito, the wooden plane with a cannon meant to sink ships. By the closing months of 1944, the wooden bomber had outlived every insult thrown its way. It was no longer the plywood toy, it was the most versatile aircraft the Allies had, and Germany knew it. Luftwaffe commanders now dreaded hearing a single phrase over the radio: unidentified contact, moving fast. Because if it was a Mosquito, there was no catching it. Even Germany's most advanced defense system, the Kammhuber line, a network of radar zones stretching from Denmark to France, was rendered useless. The Mosquito flew too high for the heavy guns and too low for the radar's sweep. It threaded through the gaps, bombed Berlin in daylight, and was gone before the sirens finished wailing. General Adolf Galland, reflecting years later, said, "It was a ghost that mocked us." We could do nothing. While German engineers worked feverishly to field the Me-262 jet fighter, the Mosquito kept exploiting one simple truth: speed was only half the equation. Planning was the other half. When the Me-262 finally entered combat in mid-1944, the world believed the age of the piston engine was over. The jet could reach 540 miles per hour, far beyond the Mosquito's top speed of about 415. But jets were fragile. Their engines overheated, their takeoff runs were long, and their fuel evaporated faster than hope. The RAF adapted instantly. Mosquito squadrons began timing raids to coincide with German jets taking off or landing. The Me-262s were most vulnerable when their engines were throttling up, slow, heavy, and unable to maneuver. The Mosquitoes would appear out of nowhere, dropping bombs or strafing airfields before the jets ever reached the sky. One after-action report from April 1945 describes it perfectly. 2 Me-262s were sighted taxiing near Neuburg. Our section dove from 10,000 feet at 450 miles per hour. Both jets were destroyed on the runway before they had time to lift. It wasn't technology that won that engagement. It was timing. Even as Germany entered the jet age, the RAF's wooden plane remained relevant, proof that agility of mind could defeat raw speed. At the same time, another version of the Mosquito was rewriting naval warfare. The FBMK-18, nicknamed the Tsetse, replaced its nose guns with a single 57mm Molin's cannon, a re-engineered anti-tank gun capable of firing 25-pound shells at 500 rounds per minute. It was so powerful that each shot made the entire aircraft shudder. These missions were flown by men who understood the risk. Hitting a ship from sea level meant skimming waves, lining up a target the size of a postage stamp, and firing before the flak found you. Yet the results were devastating. On March 10, 1944, a Tsetse Mosquito from 248 Squadron spotted the German submarine U-976 in the Bay of Biscay. One shell from the 57mm cannon tore through the conning tower, followed by rockets that sent the U-boat to the bottom. Another engagement off the Dutch coast destroyed a 500-ton coastal freighter with just 3 shells. Crews joked that the Tsetse didn't attack. It punched holes in the sea. Despite its wooden frame, the Mosquito absorbed the recoil and kept flying, proving again that simplicity could outlast brute force. As the Allies closed in on Germany, Mosquitoes hunted anything that moved: trains, convoys, radar stations. They carried rockets under each wing, bomb racks beneath the fuselage, and the kind of precision that left German commanders terrified of daylight. Even the Wehrmacht's field reports admitted defeat. One captured memo read, "The Mosquito is our greatest nuisance. We cannot defend against it. Its attacks are sudden, its disappearance immediate." It was no longer just a bomber, it was a statement. A reminder that the war machine built from wood had humbled the steel empire built on arrogance. And when the smoke finally cleared over Europe, the Mosquito stood as the last aircraft to have done everything: fighter, bomber, scout, pathfinder, and even submarine killer. It had flown over Berlin, sunk U-boats, rescued prisoners, and mocked the first jets ever built. It was fast enough to escape death, strong enough to deliver it, and beautiful enough to outlast its own legend. A wooden plane that had forced the world to rethink what was possible. By 1944, the Mosquito was no longer just a tool of war. It was a symbol of what ingenuity could achieve when metal ran short and courage ran high. But engineers at de Havilland weren't done pushing boundaries. They wanted to see just how far wood could go. That's when they built the Tsetse, an experiment so audacious it sounded like madness. Imagine this: a bomber made of birch and balsa carrying a 57mm cannon, an anti-tank weapon mounted in its nose. The idea came from a naval concept. If ships could sink submarines with deck guns, why couldn't aircraft do the same from above? The Merlin's gun, adapted from the British 6-pounder, weighed nearly as much as a small car. It fired explosive shells with enough force to pierce a U-boat's pressure hull. Engineers at Hatfield spent weeks reinforcing the Mosquito's nose section with laminated plywood ribs to absorb the recoil. When the first prototype fired, the entire airframe shook, but it held. Flight Lieutenant Tony Phillips recalled that the first time he pulled the trigger, the gun's blast nearly stopped the aircraft mid-air. "It felt," he said, "like being hit in the chest by God himself." The RAF gave it a new designation, FB Mark 18, or Tsetse, after the African fly whose bite could kill a giant. These aircraft flew long-range patrols with Coastal Command, hunting submarines and supply ships across the Bay of Biscay and the North Sea. They attacked at sea-skimming altitudes so low that salt spray streaked their windscreens. The Tsetse wasn't for rookies. Pilots had to line up a moving ship, fight the recoil, and climb away before anti-aircraft fire shredded their wooden frames. But when it worked, the results were extraordinary. In March 1944, a Mosquito from 248 Squadron, flown by Flight Lieutenant Tony Phillips and Navigator Norman Phillips, caught U-976 on the surface near Saint-Nazaire. One hit from the 57mm cannon detonated the submarine's batteries, setting off a chain reaction that split the vessel in half. Another Mosquito crew attacked U-976's sister ship, U-976A, Days later, again with deadly precision. The gun could fire up to 25 rounds per minute, though most pilots fired in short bursts to keep control. Each round carried more kinetic energy than an entire burst of the Mosquito's standard 50 caliber machine guns. And yet, the tsetse remained wooden, built from the same materials used to make furniture and violins. The genius wasn't just in firepower, it was in balance. The Mosquito's airframe distributed stress so efficiently that despite its unconventional construction, it handled the cannon's recoil better than some all-metal aircraft of the era. By late 1944, the tsetse squadrons had sunk or crippled over a dozen enemy ships. Coastal Command described the aircraft as a destroyer disguised as a dragonfly. But the Mosquito's greatest strength wasn't its weaponry. It was how it was built. Unlike other warplanes, it wasn't produced in massive metal factories. It was built in pieces, scattered across Britain and Canada. Cabinet makers, carpenters, and even piano craftsmen joined the effort. The wings were shaped in one shop, the fuselages in another, and final assembly done in aircraft hangars or converted barns. In Hatfield, women worked night shifts brushing glue onto curved molds, pressing layers of birch veneer by hand. Every component was numbered and shipped by rail to be joined with others like puzzle pieces. Even in the middle of bombings, production never stopped. A famous photograph from 1943 shows a group of workers at Leavesden factory smiling beneath a half-finished fuselage, sawdust on their boots, air raid sirens wailing outside. Across the Atlantic, de Havilland, Canada, built nearly 1,100 Mosquitoes in Toronto. Their wooden parts crafted from Canadian birch and spruce. The result was staggering. By the war's end, over 7,700 Mosquitoes had been built in more than 30 different factories, including small workshops tucked behind furniture stores and cabinet shops. Each aircraft represented a triumph of cooperation, a weapon built not by machines, but by human hands. Every screw, every wooden joint, every polished panel told the same story: that Britain's greatest weapon wasn't its steel, it was its skill. When the Mosquito finally entered mass service, its craftsmanship blurred the line between art and engineering. It didn't just look fast, it was fast because every curve, every joint, every grain of wood worked with the air, not against it. One RAF engineer famously said, "If you run your hand along her fuselage, she feels alive." By 1945, the world had seen bombers built by industry, fighters built by science, but only one aircraft built by craftsmen had changed the outcome of battles. The Mosquito wasn't made in a foundry. It was made in homes, sheds, and factories filled with glue, sawdust, and faith. A war machine carved from wood and belief.